There are moments in history when the fate of the world is not decided on the battlefield alone, but inside factories, inside steel mills glowing with molten iron, inside shipyards echoing with the sound of welding torches, inside assembly lines that never stop moving, day and night, without pause. World War II was one of those moments, a war fought across continents, across oceans, across skies filled with fire and steel. Entire nations were pushed to their limits. Cities were bombed into rubble, industries were destroyed, supply lines were broken, resources were stretched to the edge. And in that chaos, victory no longer depended only on strategy, or courage, or even technology. Victory depended on one thing above all: production, the ability to build more, faster, and continuously. And in that moment in history, one nation rose above all others: the United States of America, a country protected by two vast oceans, a country rich in resources, a country powered by innovation, and driven by a workforce unlike anything the world had ever seen. While factories across Europe were being destroyed, American factories were expanding. While other nations struggled to replace their losses, the United States multiplied its output. While the world was fighting to survive, America was building at a scale that defied imagination. This was not just industrial growth. This was industrial transformation. Car factories became tank factories. Appliance factories became weapons factories. Entire cities reorganized themselves around production. Men and women stepped into roles never seen before. Machines ran 24 hours a day. Lights never turned off. Assembly lines never stopped. And the numbers that came out of this system were beyond anything the world had ever witnessed. Hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, millions of vehicles, billions of rounds of ammunition, an endless stream of ships, engines, weapons, and supplies flowing across the world. At its peak, the United States wasn't just producing more than its enemies, it was producing more than entire nations. Combined. Think about that. One country, outproducing entire alliances, not for weeks, not for months, but consistently, relentlessly, until the balance of the war itself began to shift, because in a war of attrition, where every loss must be replaced, where every front demands resources, where every soldier depends on supply, the nation that produces more wins. And in World War II, no one produced like the United States of America. This is the story of how American factories became the most powerful weapon of the war, how industry turned into dominance, how production turned into victory, and how one nation proved that when it comes to building power at scale, no country in history has ever done it bigger, faster, or stronger than the United States of America. There are moments in history when the destiny of the world is not decided by speeches, not decided by diplomacy, and not even decided solely by the soldiers on the front lines, but by something far less visible, something louder, stronger, relentless: factories, steel, fire, production. Because in modern war, victory does not belong only to the strongest army. It belongs to the nation that can build the strongest army. Again, and again, and again. World War II was not just a war of nations. It was a war of industries, a war of economies, a war of production, across Europe and Asia. Entire countries were pushed to their absolute limits. Cities burned, factories were bombed, supply lines collapsed, resources became scarce. Every bullet mattered. Every tank mattered. Every plane mattered. And most importantly, every replacement mattered. Because in a war of this scale, loss is constant, and survival depends on one simple question. Can you replace what you lose faster than your enemy can destroy it? For many nations, the answer was uncertain. For some, the answer was no. But for one nation, the answer was overwhelming: the United States of America, a country unlike any other at that time. A nation built not only on land and people, but on systems, on infrastructure, on innovation, on scale, protected by two vast oceans. The United States had something most other nations did not: time, space, and security. While bombs fell on London, while factories burned in Germany, while entire industrial regions were threatened in the Soviet Union, American industry stood untouched, not idle, but ready. Because long before the United States entered the war, it had already built one of the most powerful industrial economies in human history. An economy capable of mass production, of standardization, of efficiency, of speed. This was the nation that had mastered the assembly line, the nation that turned automobiles into everyday life, the nation that understood how to produce not just more, but faster, cheaper, and at a scale no one else could match. And when war came, that system didn't hesitate. It transformed. Car factories became tank factories. Airplane production exploded. Shipyards expanded beyond imagination. Entire cities reorganized themselves around one goal: production for a victory. Men went to war. Women entered factories. Workers labored day and night. Lights stayed on 24 hours a day. Machines never stopped. And what emerged from this effort was something the world had never seen before: an industrial force so powerful that it didn't just support the war, it began to define it. Hundreds of thousands of aircraft filled the skies. Tens of thousands of tanks rolled across battlefields. Millions of trucks moved armies across continents. Thousands of ships crossed oceans, carrying the weight of the war on their decks. And behind every one of those machines was a factory. Behind every factory, a worker. Behind every worker, a system. And behind that system, a nation that had mastered the art of production. At its peak, the United States wasn't just producing more than its enemies, it was producing more than entire nations combined. Think about that. Not just one enemy, not just one front, but entire alliances, outmatched by the output of a single country. This wasn't luck, this wasn't coincidence, this was design, this was scale, this was power. Because while other nations fought the war, the United States built the war. It built the weapons, it built the vehicles, it built the supply chains, it built the infrastructure, it built the momentum. And once that momentum began, it never stopped. Day after day, month after month, year after year. The machines kept moving. The numbers kept growing. The output kept rising. Until eventually, the balance of the war itself began to shift. Not just because of battles won, but because of production sustained. Because in the end, war is not only about who fights harder, it's about who can keep fighting longer, who can rebuild faster, who can supply more, who can endure. And in World War II, no nation could endure like the United States. No nation could produce like the United States. No nation could match the industrial power of the United States of America. This is the story of how factories became weapons, of how industry became dominance, of how production became victory, and how one nation proved to the world: that when it comes to building power at scale, there has never been anything quite like the United States of America. Before the United States officially entered World War II, before American soldiers set foot on the battlefields of Europe or the islands of the Pacific, before Pearl Harbor shocked the nation into war, something critical was already happening. The United States was preparing, not publicly as a nation at war, but quietly, strategically, and powerfully, as a nation getting ready to shape the outcome of a global conflict. In 1939, when war erupted in Europe, the United States remained officially neutral. Many Americans did not want another war. The memory of World War I was still fresh. There was hesitation, debate, division. But while the country debated, its leaders were thinking ahead. Because what was happening overseas was not just another conflict. It was a struggle that could redefine global power. Nazi Germany was expanding rapidly across Europe. France would soon fall. Britain stood alone. And across the world. Imperial Japan was expanding its reach in Asia and the Pacific. The balance of power was shifting, and the United States understood something crucial. If these powers dominated Europe and Asia, the world would change forever, and eventually, America itself would be threatened. So even before entering the war, the United States made a decision. It would become the backbone of Allied survival. President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced a vision that would define this era. He called on America to become the arsenal of democracy. And this was not just a speech, it was a strategy that would turn American industry into the lifeline of nations fighting for survival. Because while bombs were falling in Europe, American factories were beginning to wake up. At first, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. Programs like Cash and Carry allowed Allied nations to purchase weapons and supplies from the United States. But soon that wasn't enough. Britain was running out of money, yet the war could not stop. So in 1941, the United States introduced one of the most important programs in modern history, Lend-Lease. This program changed everything. Instead of simply selling equipment, the United States would supply it. Weapons, vehicles, food, raw materials, fuel, machinery, anything necessary to keep the fight alive. And it wasn't small scale. It was massive. American factories began producing not just for domestic defense, but for entire nations. Ships loaded with supplies crossed the Atlantic, facing constant threats from German submarines. Convoys risked everything to deliver American production to the front lines, and those shipments made a difference. British aircraft stayed in the fight. Soviet forces received trucks, equipment, and materials. Allied resistance continued because American industry was feeding it. But here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. The United States was not yet fully at war, and still, its factories were already influencing the outcome. This is where the true power of American industry begins to show. Because once the decision was made, production didn't just increase, it evolved. Factories started preparing for larger contracts. Manufacturers began rethinking their capabilities. Engineers started adapting designs for mass production. Industrial planners began calculating output at levels never attempted before. The question was no longer, how much can we produce? The question became, how fast can we scale? And that difference changed everything, because scaling is power. Scaling is dominance. Scaling is what turns a strong nation into an unstoppable one. By the time 1941 arrived, the United States was no longer just observing the war. It was shaping it from behind the scenes. Its economy was shifting. Its industries were expanding. Its production lines were preparing. And its identity was changing. From a neutral nation to the industrial heart of the Allied world. So when Pearl Harbor finally came, the transformation did not begin. It accelerated, because the foundation had already been built. The factories were already moving. The systems were already forming. The momentum was already there. And once that momentum was unleashed, there was no stopping it. Because what the world was about to witness was not just industrial growth, it was industrial domination. The United States was about to turn its economic power into the most decisive weapon of the war. And it all began before the first American shot was fired. December 7th, 1941, a date that would change the course of history forever. In the early hours of that morning, the United States was still a nation not officially at war. Its factories were preparing, its industries were growing, its leaders were watching the world closely. But the full force of American power had not yet been unleashed. Then, without warning, the sky over Pearl Harbor filled with enemy aircraft. Explosions tore through battleships. Smoke rose into the air, steel twisted, fire spread across the harbor. In just a few hours, the United States was no longer a nation preparing for war. It was a nation at war. And everything changed. Not gradually, not slowly, instantly. Because what followed Pearl Harbor was one of the fastest and most powerful national mobilizations in human history. The United States did not hesitate. It did not pause. It did not struggle to decide. It moved with purpose, with clarity, with overwhelming force. Congress declared war. The American people unified, and the entire economy began to transform. This was no longer a peacetime system with wartime adjustments. This became a total war economy. Every resource mattered, every factory mattered, every worker mattered, and every second mattered. The question was no longer, should we prepare? The question became, how fast can we produce? And the answer would reshape the war. Government agencies were created almost overnight to coordinate production. Contracts were issued at unprecedented speed. Factories were expanded, redesigned, and in many cases, completely rebuilt. Production quotas skyrocketed, and industries that had once focused on consumer goods were now redirected entirely toward war. Car manufacturers stopped making civilian vehicles. Instead, they produced tanks, trucks, engines, and military transport systems. Appliance companies shifted to weapons production. Steel mills increased output beyond anything seen before. Aircraft factories multiplied in size and capacity. Shipyards expanded along both coasts and across the country. A single idea took hold. Everything for the war effort. But what made the United States truly unique was not just its willingness to mobilize. It was its ability to do so at scale. Because while other nations had already been fighting for years, they had been doing so under pressure, under bombing, under resource shortages, under constant disruption. The United States entered the war differently. Its industrial base was intact, its infrastructure was strong, its workforce was massive, its land was secure, and that meant one critical advantage: it could expand without being destroyed. Factories didn't need to be rebuilt after bombings. Railroads didn't need constant repair from attacks. Ports operated at full capacity. Production lines could run continuously. And because of that, the United States didn't just join the war, it accelerated it. The pace of production began to surge, not in small increments, but in massive leaps. Monthly output became yearly output. Yearly output became unimaginable totals. The scale was staggering. New plants were built in record time. Entire industrial complexes appeared almost overnight. Production lines stretched for miles. Machines operated around the clock. Workers rotated through shifts without interruption. Light stayed on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No pause, no slowdown. This was not just industrial activity, this was industrial intensity. And at the center of it all was coordination. The U.S. government, military, and private industry worked together in a way rarely seen before. Companies competed, but they also collaborated. Designs were standardized. Parts became interchangeable. Processes were optimized. Efficiency became a national priority. Speed became a weapon. And production became strategy. This is what separated the United States from every other nation in the war. Because while others were reacting to events, America was building momentum. While others were trying to recover from losses, America was preparing to replace them faster than they could occur. And once that system reached full speed, it created something unstoppable. A continuous flow of war materials, aircraft rolling off assembly lines, tanks moving out of factories, ships launching into the ocean, trucks filling the highways, weapons being packed and shipped, an endless stream of industrial power. And here's the most important part. This wasn't a temporary surge. This was sustained. Day after day, month after month, year after year. The United States didn't just mobilize. It maintained that momentum. And in a war of attrition, that is everything. Because when losses are inevitable, the nation that replaces faster wins. And that's exactly what began to happen. By 1942, American production was rising rapidly. By 1943, if Pearl Harbor was the spark, then industrial conversion was the explosion. Because declaring war is one thing, but transforming an entire nation into a machine built for war is something else entirely. And no country in history had ever done it at the scale, speed, and precision of the United States of America. Before the war, the United States was already the world's most advanced consumer economy. It produced cars, refrigerators, radios, machinery, everyday goods that defined modern life. Factories were optimized for comfort, for convenience, for civilian demand. But when war came, all of that changed, almost overnight. Because the question was no longer, what do people want? The question became, what does the war need? And the answer was everything: tanks, aircraft, weapons, engines, ships, trucks, ammunition, equipment, supplies. And not in small numbers, but in massive quantities. So the United States did something extraordinary. It didn't just increase production, it redefined it. Car factories stopped producing civilian vehicles entirely. Instead, they began manufacturing tanks, armored vehicles, and military transport systems. Companies that once built household appliances now built aircraft components. Typewriter manufacturers began producing rifles and machine guns. Clockmakers produced precision instruments for military use. Every industry, every machine, every worker was redirected toward one goal: victory through production. This transformation wasn't chaotic. It was organized, coordinated, engineered. Government agencies like the War Production Board were created to manage the transition. Resources were allocated, priorities were set, contracts were distributed, and industries were guided toward maximum efficiency. But what made the United States truly unique was not just that it converted its factories, it was how it converted them. Because American industry had already mastered something critical: mass production, standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line efficiency. These were not new ideas. They were the foundation of American manufacturing, and now they were applied to war. This meant weapons could be built faster, repaired, easier, replaced quicker, and produced in greater numbers than ever before. Take aircraft production as an example. Factories were redesigned to operate like flowing systems. Parts moved continuously, workers specialized in specific tasks. Time was minimized, output was maximized. The goal was not perfection in a single unit. The goal was efficiency across thousands. And that mindset changed everything, because in war, volume matters, speed matters, sustainability matters, and the United States mastered all three. One of the most powerful symbols of this transformation was the Ford Willow Run plant, a facility so massive, so efficient that it became legendary. At its peak, it was producing one B-24 bomber every hour. Think about that. A machine made of thousands of parts, complex systems, heavy engineering being completed every single hour, day and night nonstop. That wasn't just manufacturing, that was industrial dominance. But it wasn't just one factory, it was everywhere across the country. New plants were built in record time, old factories were expanded, production lines were extended, cities, adapted regions transformed. The entire nation became an industrial network. Steel from one state moved to another for shaping, then to another for assembly, then to a port, then across the ocean. Everything connected, everything synchronized, everything moving toward the same objective. And behind it all was the American workforce, millions of workers, men and women filling factories, learning new skills, working long hours, taking on roles never seen before. The rise of women in industrial labor became one of the defining features of this era. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a symbol, she was reality. Women operated machinery, built aircraft, assembled weapons, kept production running, and helped push output to unprecedented levels. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a societal transformation, and it fueled production even further. Because the more people joined the workforce, the faster factories could run. The faster factories ran, the more the United States produced, and the more it produced, the stronger it became. This created a cycle, a feedback loop of power. Production increased capacity, capacity increased output, output increased dominance, and dominance increased momentum. By the time this system reached full speed, it was unstoppable. Factories didn't just meet demand, they exceeded it. Production targets were surpassed. Output levels shattered expectations, and the scale continued to grow, because once the United States committed, it didn't think in limits. It thought in expansion. Bigger factories, faster. Production, higher output, greater reach. And this is what truly separated America from every other nation in the war. Because while others were constrained, the United States scaled. In World War II, control of the skies meant control of the war. Air power was no longer support. It was dominance. Bombers could destroy industries. Fighters could control entire regions. Transport planes could supply armies across continents. And in this new kind of warfare, one nation didn't just compete, it overwhelmed the United States of America, because when it came to aircraft production, America didn't think small. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced over 300,000 aircraft, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. That wasn't just production, that was industrial supremacy. But what made this even more powerful was how those planes were built. Instead of crafting aircraft one by one, the United States mass-produced them. Assembly lines stretched across massive factories. Parts moved continuously. Workers specialized in single tasks. Everything was optimized for speed. Aircraft became a system of repetition, and that changed everything. Because now, planes were not limited. They were abundant. Bombers like the B-17 and B-24 filled the skies. Fighters like the P-51 escorted them deep into enemy territory. Naval aircraft dominated the Pacific. Transport planes carried supplies worldwide. And behind every one of them was a factory. One of the most powerful symbols of this production was the Willow Run plant. At its peak, it produced one B-24 bomber every hour, day and night, non-stop. That level of output was unprecedented, but it wasn't just one factory. Across the country, production expanded rapidly. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and North American Aviation scaled up. Factories grew, lines multiplied, output surged, and with every month, the numbers increased. Because the United States wasn't just building aircraft, it was replacing losses, expanding fleets, supplying allies, and preparing for future battles. This created a powerful advantage: consistency. While other nations struggled with bombed factories and shortages, the United States expanded. Its industry was safe, its resources were abundant, its workforce was growing, and its production never stopped. By 1943, output was massive. By 1944, it was overwhelming. The skies were no longer balanced, they were dominated. Because when one nation can replace aircraft faster than they are destroyed, the outcome becomes inevitable. And this wasn't just about numbers, it was about strategy. With massive production came flexibility. The United States could fight in Europe, the Pacific, North Africa at the same time. Reinforcements arrived faster, operations scaled bigger. Air superiority was sustained, and all of it was powered by factories, by systems, by industrial mastery. Because in the end, the United States didn't just build planes, it built control of the skies, it built momentum, it built victory, and it proved something the world had never seen before: that when production reaches this level, war is no longer just fought, it is manufactured, and no one manufactured air power like the United States of America. Air power could dominate the skies, but wars are decided on the ground, and on the ground. Victory depends on movement, speed, supply, and overwhelming force. This is where American industry proved its power once again, because when it came to ground warfare, the United States didn't just build weapons, it built an entire system of war. During World War II, American factories produced nearly 90,000 tanks, but that was only part of the story. Because alongside those tanks, the United States produced over 2 million trucks, and that changed everything. Because a tank alone is not enough. A tank needs fuel, a tank needs ammunition, a tank needs repair, A tank needs movement, and all of that depends on logistics. While other nations focused on building fewer, more complex machines, the United States focused on something more powerful: scalability, reliability, speed. The most famous example of this was the Sherman tank. It wasn't always the most heavily armored, it wasn't always the most powerful, but it didn't need to be, because it was everywhere, built faster than the enemy could destroy it, repaired quickly in the field, transported efficiently across oceans, and supported by a massive network of vehicles and supply lines. This was the American advantage, not just strength, but presence, because in war, numbers matter, availability matters, sustainability matters, and the United States mastered all three. While German tanks were often more advanced, they were harder to produce, harder to repair, and slower to replace. American tanks, on the other hand, kept coming again and again and again. This created pressure, constant pressure, because every loss the enemy inflicted was replaced, sometimes faster than expected. And that changes the battlefield, because when one side cannot keep up with losses and the other can replace everything, momentum shifts. And once momentum shifts, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. But the real power of American ground production was not just in tanks, it was in mobility. Millions of trucks turned armies into moving systems. Supplies could reach the front faster. Troops could advance further. Operations could be sustained longer. Entire offensives became possible because the logistics were there. This is what made the United States different. It didn't just build weapons, it built the ability to use them effectively. Every tank was supported, every movement was supplied, every advance was reinforced. And that created something unstoppable: continuous ground power. Because while battles were fought at the front, victory was being built behind the lines, in factories, on assembly lines, in production systems that never stopped. And as the war continued, that system only grew stronger. By the later years of the war, American ground forces were not just equipped, they were sustained, constantly, relentlessly, at scale. And that is what made the difference, because in the end, wars are not won by a single battle. They are won by the ability to keep fighting, to keep moving, to keep supplying, to keep replacing. And no nation could do that like the United States of America. Because when it came to ground power, America didn't just build tanks, it built momentum, it built pressure, it built inevitability. And once that machine was in motion, there was no stopping it. World War II was not just fought on land or in the air, it was fought across oceans, vast, unforgiving, and absolutely critical. Because whoever controlled the seas controlled supply, controlled movement, controlled the war itself. And once again, the United States didn't just compete, it dominated. Because while other nations struggled to protect their shipping routes, America built more ships than the world had ever seen, thousands of them. Cargo ships, destroyers, battleships, aircraft carriers, transports, support vessels, an entire fleet built not over decades, but in just a few years. At the center of this power was one of the most important innovations of the war: mass-produced ships, the Liberty ships, simple, functional, efficient, designed for one purpose: to carry the war across the oceans. They weren't built to impress. They were built to be produced fast. And that's exactly what happened, at peak efficiency. A Liberty ship could be assembled in just a few days, from raw materials to a fully operational vessel. That level of speed was unheard of. And it changed everything, because German submarines were sinking ships in the Atlantic, trying to cut off supply lines, trying to starve entire nations. But the United States responded with production. For every ship lost, more were built, faster than they could be destroyed. And that turned the tide, because now the ocean was no longer a barrier. It became a highway, an endless flow of cargo, weapons, vehicles, fuel, food, all moving across the world, constantly, relentlessly. And it didn't stop there. American shipyards also produced aircraft carriers, floating air bases, capable of projecting power across entire oceans. This was especially critical in the Pacific, where distances were vast and control depended on mobility. Carrier fleets allowed the United States to strike anywhere, anytime, and every one of those carriers was built in a factory, in a shipyard, by a system designed for scale. This is what made American shipbuilding so powerful. It wasn't just about size, it was about speed, coordination, and volume. Shipyards worked nonstop, day and night. Welders, engineers, workers, all pushing production forward. Sections were pre-built, transported, assembled, launched, everything optimized, everything accelerated. And behind it all was the same advantage that defined American power: safety. While European shipyards were bombed, American shipyards expanded. While others repaired damage, the United States increased output. While others struggled to maintain fleets, America multiplied them. And that created a decisive advantage, because war across oceans depends on supply. And supply depends on ships. And ships depend on production. And in that chain, the United States was unmatched. By the middle of the war, the numbers spoke for themselves. American shipbuilding had reached a scale that no enemy could keep up with. The oceans were no longer contested equally. They were controlled, because when one nation can build ships faster than they can be sunk, control becomes inevitable. And that control meant everything. It meant troops could be transported safely. It meant supplies could reach the front. It meant operations could expand. It meant pressure could be maintained across every theater, across every front, across the entire war. Because in the end, victory was not just about fighting. It was about sustaining the fight. And sustaining the fight required the oceans. And the oceans belonged to the nation that could build the most, the fastest, the strongest. And in World War II, that nation was the United States of America. Tanks win ground, aircraft control the skies, ships dominate the oceans, but none of them can fight without firepower. And firepower comes from production, because every battle, every soldier, every advance depends on one simple thing: supply, rifles, machine guns, artillery, ammunition, explosives, equipment, and not in small amounts, but in massive, continuous volume. This is where American industry reached another level, because during World War II, the United States didn't just produce weapons, it produced them in overwhelming quantities. Millions of rifles, millions of machine guns, billions of rounds of ammunition. Let that sink in. Billions. That's not just supply. That's saturation. That's the ability to fight without stopping. Because in war, running out is not an option. And the United States made sure it never happened. Factories across the country worked nonstop. Steel was shaped into barrels. Machinery cut precision parts. Assembly lines produced weapons at incredible speed. Ammunition plants operated day and night, every bullet, every shell, every piece of equipment, moving through a system built for one purpose: continuous output. And this created a decisive advantage because while other nations had to conserve resources, the United States could expand. While others worried about shortages, America increased production. While others slowed down, America accelerated. And that changed the battlefield because soldiers equipped with consistent supply fight differently, they move faster, they push harder, they sustain pressure. And that pressure builds over time because when one side can keep firing and the other cannot, the outcome becomes inevitable. But what made American production truly powerful was not just the volume, it was the system behind it. Weapons were standardized, parts were interchangeable, repairs were faster, replacement was constant, nothing stopped, nothing slowed, everything flowed, from factory to transport to battlefield seamlessly. And this wasn't just for American forces. Through programs like Lend-Lease, the United States supplied allies as well: weapons, ammunition, equipment, keeping multiple fronts alive. At the same time, this meant American production wasn't just supporting one army, it was supporting an entire alliance, and that multiplied its impact because now the output of one nation was fueling the strength of many. And that's what made it unstoppable, because the more the United States produced, the more pressure was applied. The more pressure was applied, the more the enemy weakened, and the cycle continued again and again and again until resistance began to break. Because in the end, war is not just about who strikes harder. It's about who can keep striking, who can keep firing, who can keep supplying, and no nation could sustain that level of firepower like the United States of America. Because when it came to weapons and ammunition, America didn't just produce enough. It produced more than enough. It produced constantly, relentlessly, at a scale that overwhelmed the war itself. And once that level of production was reached, victory was no longer uncertain. It was only a matter of time. Behind every tank, every aircraft, every ship, every weapon, there is something even more important: resources. Because war is not just fought with machines. It is built from what those machines are made of: steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, energy. Without them, nothing moves, nothing flies, nothing fights. And in World War II, no nation had access to resources like the United States of America. While other countries struggled with shortages, the United States had abundance. Massive reserves of oil, huge deposits of coal and iron, expansive industrial land, a power grid capable of sustaining non-stop production. And this changed everything, because while others were limited, America could expand. Oil powered the war, fuel for tanks, fuel for trucks, fuel for ships, fuel for aircraft. Without oil, modern warfare stops, and the United States was one of the largest oil producers in the world. That meant mobility. That meant reach. That meant power. Steel built the war. Every ship, every tank, every weapon, every structure, all depended on steel. And American steel production operated at enormous scale, feeding factories across the nation, supplying multiple industries at once without slowing down. Aluminum powered the skies. Aircraft required lightweight, durable materials, and the United States produced aluminum in massive quantities, allowing continuous aircraft production, allowing expansion, allowing dominance. Energy powered everything. Factories don't run without electricity, machines don't move without power, production doesn't happen without energy, and the United States had the infrastructure to sustain it. Power plants, grids, distribution systems, all operating at full capacity day and night without interruption. This created a chain. Resources fed factories, factories fed production, production fed the war, and the war fed momentum, and that momentum never stopped. Because while other nations faced limits, the United States removed them. While others had to ration, America scaled. While others adapted under pressure, America expanded with strength. And this is what made the difference, because in modern war, resources are power, energy is power, production is power, and the nation that controls all three controls the outcome. By the later years of the war, the United States wasn't just keeping up, it was leading. Its factories were producing at full speed. Its supply chains were uninterrupted. Its materials were flowing continuously. And its capacity kept growing because the United States wasn't fighting from scarcity. It was fighting from organized abundance. And that is one of the most powerful advantages any nation can have, because when you have more resources, you can build more. When you can build more, you can replace faster. When you replace faster, you sustain pressure. And when pressure is sustained, victory becomes inevitable. This is why American industry became unstoppable. Because it wasn't just about factories, it was about what fueled them, what fed them, what powered them. And the United States had it all, at scale, at speed, without interruption. Because in the end, war is not only about strategy or strength, it is about capacity. The capacity to build, the capacity to sustain, the capacity to endure. And no nation in World War II had that capacity like the United States of America. Machines build weapons, factories produce power, but none of it happens without people. And in World War II, the greatest strength of the United States was not just its industry, it was its people. Because when war demanded more, America didn't just respond, it mobilized. At a scale the world had never seen. Millions of men left for the battlefield, and that created a challenge. Who would keep the factories running? The answer changed history. Women, for the first time on a massive scale. Women entered industrial work, operating machines, building aircraft, assembling weapons, driving production forward. Rosie the Riveter became more than a symbol. She became the backbone of the war effort. Factories filled with new workers, new energy, new determination, and production didn't slow down. It increased, because this wasn't just about filling jobs, it was about expanding capacity. The workforce grew, shift after shift, day and night, around the clock. Factories never stopped. Lights stayed on, machines kept running, and output kept rising. But it wasn't just women. Workers from across the country moved into industrial centers. Cities expanded. Communities transformed. The entire nation began to reorganize around production. And despite challenges, despite inequality, despite long hours, the system held, because there was a shared understanding. Everything mattered, every worker, every shift, every task, because behind every tank, every aircraft, every ship, there was a person, and millions of those people were working together at the same time, toward the same goal. This created something powerful: unity, a connection between the home front and the battlefield. Soldiers fought overseas, workers built at home, and both were part of the same effort. This is what made American production different. It wasn't just industrial, it was cultural. Production became patriotism, work became contribution, factories became part of the war. And that mindset drove performance even higher. Because when people believe their work matters, they push harder, they move faster, they endure longer. And that's exactly what happened. The United States didn't just build machines, it built momentum through people, through effort, through scale. And that scale was unmatched. Millions of workers, millions of hours, millions of products, all connected, all moving forward, all feeding the same system. And that system never stopped. Because while the war demanded everything, the American workforce delivered again and again and again until production reached levels no nation could match. And that's what made the difference, because in the end, wars are not won by machines alone. They are won by the people who build them. And no nation had more people working harder, producing faster, and sustaining longer than the United States of America. World War II was one of the greatest conflicts in human history. A war fought across continents, across oceans, across skies filled with fire, millions of lives, countless battles, unimaginable destruction. But behind every victory, behind every advance, behind every turning point, there was something greater: production. Because in the end, wars are not won by a single moment. They are won over time, through endurance, through replacement, through the ability to keep going when others cannot. And that is where the United States of America stood above all. It didn't just fight the war, it sustained it. It didn't just build weapons, it built the system behind them: factories, supply chains, logistics, workforce, resources, all connected, all moving, all producing, at a scale the world had never seen. Aircraft filled the skies, tanks moved across continents, ships crossed entire oceans, weapons flowed endlessly to the front lines, and none of it stopped. Because the United States didn't just produce more, it produced continuously, relentlessly, without interruption. While other nations struggled with shortages, the United States expanded. While others faced destruction, America built. While others tried to keep up, America moved ahead. And that difference changed everything. Because in a war of attrition, where losses are constant, the nation that replaces faster wins, and no one replaced faster. No one produced more. No one sustained longer than the United States of America. At its peak, American factories were not just supporting one front, they were supplying the world, fueling armies, equipping allies, driving the momentum of an entire global war. This was not just industrial strength, this was industrial dominance, the ability of one nation to outproduce entire nations combined. And in doing so, to shift the balance of history, because when the war ended, the impact did not disappear. It remained in infrastructure, in economy, in global influence. The United States emerged not just as a victor, but as the central power of the modern world. And it all traces back to one defining truth: that in World War II, power was not only measured by armies, but by factories, by output, by scale, by the ability to build faster than destruction, stronger than opposition, and longer than anyone else, because in the end, the war was not only fought, it was manufactured. And no nation in history has ever manufactured power like the United States of America.